Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Martin Madar. I'm a co-director of the Institute of Spirituality and Social Justice here at Xavier University, which includes our graduate program in theology. On behalf of the Institute, and together with the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue, Bellarmine Chapel, and St. Xavier Church, I want to welcome you at this second lecture in the series titled Vatican II at 60. We have prepared this series because we want to bring attention to the Council as a gift to the Church, a gift whose reception is still in process. Our goal is not simply to rehash the decades-long debates or to memorialize a generational event, but rather to inquire into the Council's legacy, the legacy for us today, and to reflect on where Catholics are in implementing the Council's vision. 2 weeks ago, I spoke about what happened to the Council's vision of the Church. My focus was on the Council's treatment of the Church in its inner life. I said that the Council had a lot to say also about the Church in its outer life, namely in its relationship with the world. And that's the topic for today. So let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Marcus Mescher, who joined Xavier's theology faculty in 2014. He is currently Associate Professor of Christian Ethics. Dr. Mescher earned his Master's in Theological Studies and his PhD at Boston College, specializing in Catholic social thought and moral formation. His scholarship focuses on several areas of the moral life, including the impact of digital technology and social media on identity, agency, and relationships, the ethical dimensions of marriage and family life, and how to practice solidarity with non-human creation. He is the author of nearly 50 articles written for both academic and popular audiences, as well as The Ethics of Encounter, Christian Neighbor Love as a Practice of Solidarity, published by Orbis Books in 2020. Dr. Mescher and his family have been members of Bellarmine Chapel since moving to Cincinnati in 2014. Please help me welcome Dr. Marcus Mescher.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real treat to be with you tonight. I appreciate you being here and making time for this amid just a lot going on in the world and also in our church. And I think we should give Dr. Madar a round of applause because he's the one who's organized this series, and it's been a lot of work. So we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of Vatican II, and I'm grateful for this series so that we can better understand and receive the gift of the Second Vatican Council, especially from this moment in time. I do have slides for my presentation with a lot of words on them, so if it's going to be hard for you to see, you are invited to come up closer to the front here so that you're not straining your eyes. Because there are some really great passages that I hope we can sit with and unpack together. So as Dr. Madar just said, 2 weeks ago, you heard Dr. Madar highlight some of the contextual features of the Second Vatican Council, including the inner life of the Church. Tonight, I have the pleasure of reflecting on Gaudium et Spes, the final document of Vatican II, which focuses on the outer life of the Church and what it means to be the Church in our present time. Gaudium et Spes departs from a long history of hostility toward and condescension for a sinful world. Instead, it calls for a relationship with the world marked by solidarity, respect, and love for the entire human family with which the Church is bound up. So tonight, you can see I'm just going to try to give you a little bit of context for the Second Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes, and then look at just a couple themes, we could probably do a whole series just on Gaudium et Spes. It's a really rich document. I find a lot of consolation in reading through the paragraphs, and if you haven't read Gaudium et Spes, I recommend spending time with it. Among the most important claims in this document is the lamentation of one of the more serious errors of our age, which is the split between the faith which many profess and their daily lives. In light of the fact that Gaudium et Spes invites us to reconsider how to be Christian disciples in our time, my presentation considers the demands of discipleship through three themes: the practice of contemplation, the formation of moral conscience, and the work of building the culture of encounter. Taken together, these commitments are vital avenues for the renewal of the church, where mission and communion orbit around solidarity with and salvation for the whole world. So first, a couple words about the context of the document. The generative theme of Gaudium et Spes is a conversation following Jesus' style of engaging his contemporaries and reading the signs of the times, as we see in Matthew 16. To converse is both to listen and to speak, and even more, a good conversation is the result of people who are attentive and responsive to each other. Conversations move us from strangers to companions. They lead us toward relationship with one another, and Gaudium et Spes expands what we might imagine possible thanks to reciprocal relationships between what the church offers to and receives from the world. Promulgated on December 7th, 1965 by Pope Paul VI, this pastoral constitution is a tribute to the spirit of Pope John the 23rd and his vision of a church that takes responsibility for the world in faith, hope, and love. But really, the document takes shape following the interjection of Archbishop Dom Helder Câmara of Brazil, who asked his brother bishops, "Are we to spend our whole time discussing internal church problems while 2/3 of humanity is dying of hunger? What have we to say on the problem of underdevelopment? Will the Council express its concern about the great problems of humanity?" You can see in this interjection, Dom Helder Câmara is reading the signs of the times. Because of the way in which he accompanied people in the favelas, the slums in Brazil, he was trying to think about what can the church say to the poor to show them that we see you, we hear you, we love you, and we're with you. Last week, I was in Warsaw, Poland, giving a talk on the ethics of encounter for a conference organized between the U.S. Catholic bishops and the bishops of Eastern Europe. And it was really moving to not only be able to engage with priests and women religious and lay people from Poland and Belarus and Slovakia and other countries in Eastern Europe, but most especially from members of the church in Ukraine. And while I was hopeful that I had something valuable to share on the ethics of encounter, it was really sobering to meet with people living in Ukraine right now who are trying to figure out what does it mean to be church when Russia is dropping bombs on our houses or on our churches. And I think that's part of the invitation that Gaudium et Spes extends to us today. You know, we kind of mistranslate the title. We say it's the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, as if it's distinguishing it from another era in history, or we can debate between whether we're living in the modern or the postmodern age or whatever. But really, if you read the French or the Spanish or the Italian, you see that the real vision of this is to be the church today, right now. And so my hope is that this presentation is not only like a retrospective on what we received from Gaudium et Spes 60 years ago, but hopefully is illuminating and encouraging for all of us to consider how are we being called and empowered to be the church that the world needs right now. So in light of this interjection, I think it's worth just reflecting for a moment how Câmara's prophetic question should keep us from any ignorance or indifference to the most urgent problems in the world today. We must dialogue and discern together how to embrace our vocation as promoters of the goodness of creation, as partners with the Holy Spirit's redemptive work in the world. As another example of what it was like to receive this document, we have Sister Elizabeth Johnson, who recounts what it was like to read an initial draft of Gaudium et Spes just before taking her final vows. She recalls drinking it in like water in the desert, moved by this theological vision of humanity created in the image of God, defaced by the evil of sin, but redeemed by Christ, and now led in history by the Spirit through the witness of the Church. She reflects, "This was a vision I had never before encountered, and it was so beautiful." And after finishing her reading through the draft of Gaudium et Spes, she concluded, "I was possessed with an overriding conviction, this is worth my life." And so it has proved to be. She's one of the most important Catholic theologians from the United States, and I think it's beautiful how she sees her entire career as a Catholic theologian really finding its anchor in Gaudium et Spes. Reading Gaudium et Spes today, especially in the face of so many challenges to the Church from inside and outside the institution, and at both the local and the universal level, these words sound a call to fidelity, not just to Christ or the Church, but the whole human family. This spirit of faithfulness is expressed by its memorable opening lines. The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in our hearts. To be part of the Catholic community is to be a person oriented toward encountering others and accompanying them with humility, curiosity, compassion, and forging partnership to create a more humane social order that celebrates unity in diversity. But how do we do that? It sounds really nice, but we see a world that's marked by sin and people who are very busy and don't have time just to sit around for dialogue and discernment, which is why I think it's worth highlighting how Gaudium et Spes is the fruit of contemplation. This is a line from paragraph 15, how it's describing how it came to be as a result of contemplation and appreciation of the divine plan unfolding in the world. So Gaudium et Spes was written because of the Council Fathers took time to try to pay attention, to look around, to look for what God is up to in the world, and to try to look for wisdom not only in reading Scripture or in church documents, but in the world around them. So in Gaudium et Spes, the document explains how contemplation produces wisdom, leads to worship, and seeks the integral perfection of the human person to the good of the community and the whole society. It means cultivating a religious, moral, and social sense that informs how to respond to a melancholy state of humanity. Contemplation is not a beatific vision. It requires an honest account of the wounds marking the body of Christ due to vanity and malice and the powers of darkness that lead humanity astray. Just as St. Paul observed that if one part of the body of Christ suffers, all parts suffer with it, this document envisions a church of compassion, willing to enter into the suffering and share the burden together. Reasons for grief and anxiety ought to inspire all members of the church to be agents of healing by relying on God's endless gifts of grace and love. In order to advance integral human flourishing, the church raises its prophetic voice not to condemn the world, but to denounce sinful beliefs, practices, and structures, and also announce a more charitable way of interacting, which, as the document says, to enlighten one another through honest discussion, preserving mutual love, and caring above all for the common good. Again, this sounds really nice, but how do we do this? I often think of this line from the Dutch clockmaker Corrie ten Boom. And if you can see this image, this is her in her bathroom. Sorry to have a picture of a bathroom in the church sanctuary. But she's showing us how she created a false wall in her bathroom so that she could hide Jews from Nazis during World War II. And the entrance was underneath one of the shelves in this line of shelves you can see in her home. And I think she's onto something when she says, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. Because she was really distraught, not only by what the Nazis were doing in Europe, but all the Christians around her who seemed unmoved by the persecution or the rounding up of Jewish people, the collection of all their possessions, sending them off into trains never to be seen again. And it's easy, to just say, well, I'm not Jewish, they're not coming for me, I'm going to worry about myself, or I have a lot going on, I've got to take care of mine, my family, or, I don't know how to add anything into my overflowing plate. So the reason why I want to dwell on this point of contemplation is to think about all the things that get in the way of our ability to pay attention. And not just pay attention, but when I use contemplation, I'm really thinking of it as it's defined by Father Walter Burghardt, a Jesuit priest, who describes contemplation as taking a long, loving look at the real. This means slowing down, pausing our very busy and sometimes distracted lives, trying to break through the temptation to self-deception or the desire for absolution, where we want to absolve ourselves of any kind of responsibility or culpability for the problems that we recognize in the church and world. Contemplation means seeing as God sees, looking at creation and seeing it all as very good, as we read in the first chapter of Genesis. Practicing contemplation puts us in touch with what is good in us and around us. It is a reminder that grace is always and everywhere at work, even in an unseen way, in every human heart. Gaudium et Spes presents a theological anthropology, a Christian vision of being human, where the human person is bent toward evil. There's ample evidence of that, right? We see plenty of evil in the world, but who, with the help of grace, is made truly new and artisans of a new humanity. So that's what I love about Gaudium et Spes. It's saying that we don't have to settle for the church or the world as we see it right now. That the gift of grace is always inviting us to be made new and to make the world made new all over again. When the forces of sin are overcome by the works of charity, when peace and justice are realized, these feats, along with other triumphs of the human race, are a sign of God's grace present in the world. Although this document is sometimes criticized for being idealistic, its attentiveness to grace echoes St. Paul's claim that Christ's resurrection makes us all share part in a new creation. That's in his second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, where Paul says, we are now a new creation, and we have been charged with being Christ's ambassadors of reconciliation, called to heal a wounded world. The church is tasked with dispensing the treasures of grace for the world, not only by preaching the gospel, but ensuring peace everywhere on earth and facilitating the fraternal exchange between persons. Here we may recognize traces of what Pope Francis would later call the culture of encounter. When Christians practice contemplation and look with eyes of love, it is not just a matter of refining one's perception, since we learn from Thomas Aquinas that the effect of love is union. When we practice contemplation, it leads us toward communion. So, as you picked up from the title of this talk, one of the themes I wanted to engage is this grave error of our time, which is the split between the faith which many profess and their daily lives, which Gaudium et Spes says is due, at least in part, to the discharge of certain moral obligations by those who plunge themselves into earthly affairs in such a way as to imply that these are altogether divorced from religious life. To remedy this grave error, the Council Fathers call on Christians to turn their attention inward, to hear the voice of conscience and heed the natural law that is written on the human heart, as we read in Romans chapter 2, verse 15. Gaudium et Spes ushers in a paradigm shift in Catholic moral theology. And since I'm a Catholic moral theologian, I have to talk about this because it's a really big deal for Catholic ethics. So Gaudium et Spes places great stress that each and every person possesses the innate capacity to search for truth and learn how best to love God and neighbor. You don't just have to read the catechism or read the Bible or listen to your priest or your professor, right? By virtue of being human, you have the innate capacity to search for truth and learn how best to love God and neighbor. Etymologically, conscience means to know together, indicating that conscience is a shared activity and not just a private source of moral wisdom or an inviolable sanctuary for ethical judgment. So it's not Jiminy Cricket whispering in your ear, telling you what to do. It's not an angel on one shoulder and a demon on the other. It's an inherent capacity to reveal that being human is fundamentally relational, and we can only really know what is right, true, good, and just when we're in relationship with one another and we listen and learn from one another. Gaudium et Spes touts the role of the church as a worldwide authority in conscience formation, and also acknowledges how science and human experience play a key role in helping people to know, love, and do what is right, true, good, and just. Conscience formation is a lifelong task to inform and transform not only my own conscience, but others as well. Sources of moral wisdom are all around us, if only we pay attention. Gaudium et Spes makes clear that the moral conscience is not ordered to following rules, but discerning how to properly reverence the human person, since everyone must consider their every neighbor, without exception, as another self. This includes a special obligation for those who are marginalized, vulnerable, and made to live in poverty, so as not to imitate the rich man who had no concern for the poor man Lazarus, as the document discusses in paragraph 27. The Council Fathers explain that any insult to human dignity and freedom ought to disturb our conscience, recalling that how we treat the least among us is the measure for how we treat Jesus Christ. Actions opposed to the fullness of life for all bring supreme dishonor to God. For this reason, Christians must be vigilant against any kind of callous indifference or apathy in the face of human suffering or the destruction of our complex and interdependent ecosystems. Faith can never be compartmentalized from the world around us or the demands of our everyday lives, since the vocation of every Christian is to participate in the unfolding reign of God in our midst. When we are diligent in the shared practice of conscience formation, we get closer to God's dream when no person, and therefore no set of joys or hopes, griefs or anxieties, lie beyond our moral concern. So this brings us to the culture of encounter. In light of how Gaudium et Spes envisions the relationship between the church and the world as a conversation and aims to mend the split between faith and everyday life, it is worth highlighting how the Council Fathers insist that faith must be practiced in every venue and in every interaction. They write, quote, "Respect and love ought to be extended also to those who think or act differently than we do in social, political, and even religious matters. In fact, the more deeply we come to understand their ways of thinking through courtesy and love, the more easily will we be able to enter into dialogue with them." That's the end of that quote from paragraph 28. Gaudium et Spes affirms the equal dignity of every human person. On the one hand, this demands that Christians work for a more humane and just condition of life for all. On the other, this means that we have much to learn from listening to one another and sharing life together. Authentic dialogue requires a mutual respect for the full spiritual dignity of each person and informs how to deliver on our reciprocal duties to one another. These fruitful exchanges should exclude no one, since the ultimate goal is to accomplish an ever more inclusive solidarity, which reflects the flawless glory of God in recognizing all human beings as siblings in God's one human family. These passages are significant roots for the culture of encounter that Pope Francis introduced early in his pontificate. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis described how individuals become a community, right? If we feel like we're stuck in crisis or in a social context marked by social fragility and fracture or distrust and division, we might listen to these words that Pope Francis authored in 2013. We must share part in an ongoing process in which every new generation must take part, a slow and arduous effort calling for a desire for integration and a willingness to achieve this through the growth of a peaceful and multifaceted culture of encounter. Over his 12-year pontificate, Pope Francis filled out a picture of what this culture of encounter entails. However, he would be the first to acknowledge that this culture of encounter is not his own invention. Rather, it arises in faithful witness of Jesus Christ, who modeled how God encounters humanity in the incarnation. These are some of my favorite words that he wrote as Pope, so I'll read them for you. Pope Francis writes, "The gospel calls us constantly to run the risk of face-to-face encounter with others, with their physical presence which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy which infects us in our close and continuous interaction. True faith in the incarnate Son of God is inseparable from self-giving, from membership in the community, from service, and from reconciliation with others. The Son of God, by becoming flesh, summoned us to the revolution of tenderness." I think that's worth dwelling just for a moment with, thinking about how we are summoned to receive and to share part in and to extend this revolution of tenderness. When Pope Francis was asked about this, why is tenderness so important to you? He would say, when things become rigid, they become close to death. And when we become fixed and stuck in our ways, or you can maybe even think of a human body that has become less flexible, unless you're doing yoga or Pilates or you have some magic trick, right? But I think it's an interesting insight that Francis tells us. When things become rigid, they are closer to death and being closed off. But tenderness is the only way to live in a fruitful way. And I think if the world needs anything right now, it's a lot more tenderness. And if we feel unworthy or incapable of participating in this revolution of tenderness, I think it points to the need for us to make time for contemplation, taking that long, loving look at the real so that we can see ourselves as loved infinitely and unconditionally, and to recognize that in the same way that we are loved exactly as we are, and so is everyone else we meet. In the same way that I am worthy of tenderness, so is everyone I encounter. The culture of encounter is how disciples respond to God's summons to the revolution of tenderness. To avoid this from becoming an abstraction, I want to just take a little bit of time to examine how this is illustrated in one encounter in the Gospel of Mark. So, as a product of 14 years of Jesuit education, I've been shaped deeply by Ignatian spirituality, and other members of Bellarmine Chapel or other people who are familiar with Ignatian spirituality know that St. Ignatius of Loyola would invite us to enter the scene in the Gospels, to imagine the composition of place, to use our senses, to imagine what the scene looks like and smells like and sounds like, so that we're not just reading this story as we've heard it so many times throughout our lives, but we're imagining it unfold before our eyes as if it's happening for the very first time, right? To allow a permanent revolution in our ability to receive the Word of God, or to imagine how God is calling us to replicate or to emulate Jesus' teaching and healing ministry in our time. So I'm going to read this passage, and I invite you, if you feel comfortable, to close your eyes. If that feels too awkward for you, you might just drop your gaze to your lap. But I'd invite you to just try to imagine yourself in this scene, and not only as a passive observer, as someone who's watching this interaction between Jesus and Bartimaeus, but as the characters in the story. You might try them on as you listen to the story. What is it like to be the disciples who are trying to make sense of what Jesus is doing? What is it like to be Bartimaeus, this man who was blind and who's been cut off from the community? What is it like to be Jesus? And how do these different characters help you to see something new that you might have previously missed? Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho. As Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind man, son of Timaeus, sat by the roadside begging. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, Bartimaeus cried out and said, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." And many rebuked him, telling Bartimaeus to be silent. But Bartimaeus kept calling all the more, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So the disciples called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, get up, he is calling you." Bartimaeus threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. Jesus asked Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus replied, "Master, I want to see." Jesus told him, "Go your way, your faith has saved you." Immediately, Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus on the way. So you can keep your eyes closed for just a moment, and I just want to offer a little bit of time for you to reflect with this story and some questions I have. Since this is a familiar story, it might be easy to jump to the end and just say, I know the point of this story. But if you take a long, loving look at this scene, what do you see that you might otherwise miss? Why is Bartimaeus begging on the side of the road? As a blind man, Bartimaeus was viewed by his contemporaries as a sinner. His blindness was a punishment from God, and no one wanted to associate with him. Bartimaeus had been shunned and cut off from his community. He had no friends, and his family disowned him. He is blind, so he cannot do much of anything to provide for himself. So in this moment, contemplate Bartimaeus, drowning in darkness, exiled in shame. The only way he can survive is when people take enough pity on him to provide him with some food or drink or a few coins. Bartimaeus is utterly alone. He does not count or belong. Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus in pure desperation. Now contemplate the crowd and the disciples. Why do they rebuke Bartimaeus and tell him to keep quiet? It may be because Bartimaeus is not recognized for having equal dignity or belonging to their community. In Jesus' time, people believed that the blind were suffering from a divine curse or punishment, that God was angry with them for their sins or their ancestors' sins, and so they deserved their blindness. They deserved to suffer. They did not want to associate with them because they did not want to catch that divine curse or punishment. So as a result, Bartimaeus is socially invisible and insignificant. He is a non-person. It may also be because Jesus is on the move. He has places to go and people to teach, and the crowd may assume that Bartimaeus is not worth Jesus' time or attention. But notice how Jesus stops and calls Bartimaeus. And then Bartimaeus springs into action. He comes alive, drawing near to Jesus. Jesus could heal Bartimaeus immediately, and perhaps the crowd would marvel at Jesus' divine power. But what does Jesus do? He asks Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" As fully human and fully divine, Jesus likely knew what Bartimaeus wanted. So why does he bother to ask? I think it's because this gesture of humility and curiosity illuminate the revolution of tenderness. Jesus does not presume. He does not offer a quick fix. Instead, Jesus makes Bartimaeus seen and heard. He empowers Bartimaeus to assert his own dignity and agency by raising his voice and speaking for himself. Now, I think it's easy to jump to the conclusion that this story is about Jesus' power to perform miracles, or we might analyze how Jesus' gift of sight to Bartimaeus is a gift that he offers to us today. But I think if we stopped here, we would miss the point. I think this story is less about Jesus curing Bartimaeus' blindness and more about Jesus pointing out the blindness of the people who could not recognize Bartimaeus' dignity, who did little to promote his agency, and who cut him off from their community. They saw Bartimaeus through the lens of stigma, reducing him to someone who did not matter or belong to them. And if we contemplate this scene, we are left to consider not just who the Bartimaeuses are of today, but those whose dignity, agency, and sense of belonging we struggle to acknowledge. All right, you can open your eyes, and I'll try to land the plane here so we've got some time for your insights and questions. When people talk about the culture of encounter, they may invoke the importance of dialogue or the manner in which people are shaped by interactions with others. Certainly, I think the culture of encounter seems related to Pope Francis's emphasis on synodality and trying to be a church that journeys together to listen and learn from one another. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis fills out a picture of what he means by this culture of encounter, and he explains. Sorry, this is a lot of words. I know, Dr. Galler, you're not happy with me. This is way too many words for a PowerPoint slide. Mea culpa. But these words are too important to skip over. So Pope Francis writes in Fratelli Tutti, "Life, for all its confrontations, is the art of encounter. I have frequently called for the growth of a culture of encounter capable of transcending our differences and divisions. This means working to create a many-faceted polyhedron whose different sides form a variegated unity in which the whole is greater than the part." I love that image of a polyhedron, not a perfect circle or a sphere where every point along the perimeter is equidistant from the center, but making room for diversity and difference and being able to find unity even in the face of rough edges. The image of a polyhedron can represent a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations. Each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless, and no one is expendable. This also means finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, for they have another way of looking at things. They see aspects of reality that are invisible to the centers of power where weighty decisions are made. To speak of a culture of encounter means that we, as a people, should be passionate about meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. To create the conditions for this culture of encounter, then we must take up the contemplative gaze of Jesus, who can recognize the dignity of all, even those who are shunned or excluded, those people that we might struggle to like or love. We must resist the lie that some lives matter less than others and respond to others with an extravagant tenderness that is not conditioned by or contingent on any factor. We must be passionate about meeting others, which means making ourselves available to them, not expecting them to come to us, meet us on our terms, or darken the doorways of our churches, schools, or offices. Gaudium et Spes closes by asserting that, and this is a quote, "Christians cannot yearn for anything more ardently than to serve the people of today with mounting generosity and success. Therefore, by holding faithfully to the gospel and benefiting from its resources, by joining with every person who loves and practices justice, Christians have shouldered a gigantic task for the flourishing of this world." This is a vision of the church that solidarizes the world. Here, I use solidarity as a verb, which I think is better than how it is often defined in Catholic social teaching. I came to this insight thanks to several trips to El Salvador, including with Tess. Tess, it's so great to see you. Thanks for coming. I've been able to go to El Salvador with the AB program and the CFJ, and through Theo 422, a course I've been able to teach 3 times in the last 5 years. That includes an immersive learning experience hosted by the UCA, the Jesuit University in San Salvador. We go to El Salvador to learn about the witness of church leaders like the 6 Jesuit priests who were killed along with their housekeeper and her 15-year-old daughter on November 16th, 1989, the 4 U.S. church women who were raped and murdered on December 3rd, 1980, and St. Oscar Romero, who was assassinated while he was celebrating Mass in a chapel next to a cancer hospital on March 24th, 1980. I want to talk a little bit about St. Oscar Romero, whose steadfast fidelity to the crucified people suffering amid a civil war that took the lives of 75,000 civilians cost him his life. Reading his pastoral letters, one cannot miss how deeply influenced he was by the legacy of Gaudium et Spes and the extent of his commitment to sentir con la Iglesia, which is that's what's sewn into his bishop's mitre in the picture in the middle. We might translate sentir con la Iglesia as to feel with the church, but my friends who are Salvadoran tell me that it actually is more accurate to translate that as to have one heart and one mind with the church. This commitment to feel with the church is in fidelity to his vision of being a church in his time and his place. When Salvadorans reflect on how they try to honor the legacy of St. Romero and the 4 U.S. churchwomen and the UCA martyrs, they describe all of these martyrs as calling and empowering them to realize solidarity in the here and the now. And I think that picture on the right, this is a picture from Romero's home that you can visit. I think it's a really beautiful illustration of what solidarity means. When I first saw this picture, I had to do a double take because I've never seen an archbishop sitting in the grass. But that's exactly what's happening here. Sorry, the image on your left, that's Romero in the corner. They're on the side of the road. You can see a little bit of the van there. They just took a pit stop for a coffee break, and St. Romero has a coffee cup in one hand and a tortilla in the other, and he's just shooting the breeze, sharing life with his people. He's, as Pope Francis would say, he's a shepherd who smells like his sheep. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's so beloved by the people in El Salvador. But in El Salvador, they don't talk about solidarity as a noun, solidaridad, as much as they do a verb. And I think that's better. It's an improvement, because I don't think we should think of solidarity as just a thing that we do, or, in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, Pope John Paul II defines solidarity as a virtue and a firm and persevering commitment to the common good, which sounds nice, but it still keeps the focus on the individual moral agent, as if solidarity is a box we can check with the right attitude or the right action, and it misses out on the fact that no one can do solidarity alone. This is a point that I actually made in my talk in Warsaw last week, and it was really moving because afterwards there were some Ukrainian bishops and priests and nuns who came up to me, really moved by the witness of St. Oscar Romero, and who told me that there are so many Romeros right now in Ukraine, and they pray that one day we'll hear their story and not only just honor them as a moral exemplar, but that we'll join the work, that we will solidarnos. The way to translate that from the Spanish is as a verb that we put into action together. It's a little bit tricky to translate solidarnos, but I think the best way to try would be to say we solidarize ourselves together by being in right relationship with warmth, with tenderness, with a kind of sacred trust and respect, and a fidelity that tries to share life together, even when life is really hard. We solidarize ourselves together, which is less a matter of an individual's attitude or actions than the quality of our relationships. When the church presents solidarity as social charity or social friendship, it reminds us that no one can do solidarity alone. For this reason, solidarity is not just one virtue among others or a moral principle used to measure our choices, priorities, or the health of our communities, or the extent of our inclusion and interdependence. It is how we bear witness to the triune communion of love, the God who is love that is offered, received, and returned, in whose image and likeness we are made. The culture of encounter is the first step towards solidarizing ourselves together, animated by contemplation that inspires tenderness and conscience formation that urges us to draw near those who question if they matter or belong. As we celebrate the 60th anniversary of Gaudium et Spes, may the vision of the church that solidarizes the world expand what we imagine possible, so that we can better honor the dignity of each and every human being, forge mutually tender, respectful, and responsible relationships, and promote the integral flourishing of God's very good creation. Thank you. So now I think we have some time for your insights or questions or anything that you feel like sharing. Addison, way to break the ice.
Okay, so then how can we overcome a fear to achieve solidarity with each other when we live in a world with so much competition?
What do you think is the root of that competition?
People want power over one another.
Yeah, why do we want control or power over others?
It makes us feel like we did something or are worth something more.
Yeah, and I think it's a way to compensate for insecurity or fear. And I think that's why we need contemplation. We need to take that long, loving look at the real so that we can get in touch with our own unshakable goodness and see competition for what it is, right? It's a silly game, right? And it's like being a hamster on a wheel. Or I had this little Sicilian grandmother. She was adorable, and she used to have these little pearls of wisdom. And she told me once, worrying is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. And I think sometimes that's competition, right? It gives us something to focus on. It could be a distraction. It maybe helps us feel good in the moments when we win or we have some advantage over others. We feel pretty terrible when others beat us or have some advantage over us. But I think if we took more time to practice contemplation and really saw that in God's eyes, we couldn't be one bit better, right? Then we don't have to participate in the competition for validation or affirmation, because that unshakable goodness is a constant. And maybe it would free us from some of the anxiety or insecurity or the fear or the suspicion or the measuring. Right? I think of that line from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." I think if we practice more time for contemplation and we really were in touch with our goodness and the goodness of others, then we wouldn't be as insecure or fearful that we would have to one-up other people or worried that they're one-upping us.
We live in a divided world as people separate from those who feel like we're here to take care of ourselves first and take care of others second. How do you see a Christian responding today in that culture today that's led politically and led sociologically by so many people? I think of all the young people who followed this fellow that was just assassinated because they loved what he was saying and saying, "We come first." How do we respond?
I'd say that'd be really hard to square a radical self-interest with the Gospels or with a Christian vision of being human. In Philippians, we read that Christians should consider others as more important than themselves. It's Philippians 2, right before the Christ hymn, where it talks about how God, although he was, Jesus, although he was the form of God, emptied himself, and we get that verb kenosis, this vision of God who is self-emptying love. I think it's a sobering reminder that for every Christian person, our center of gravity should be outside of ourselves. Right? There's no command in the gospel to love yourself. The closest we get is to love your neighbor as yourself. Right? So that implies that there should be some concern for self-preservation, right? Like, I'm not trying to say that we should embrace such a radical self-gift that it becomes self-annihilation. But I think to be someone like Christ is to be kenotic, to be agapic, to be self-giving, and to put others ahead of ourselves. And I think if we connect that to this revolution of tenderness and contemplation, then we see that in the same way that we are trying to be generous with others, God is constantly giving God's self to us. So it's not self-emptying as if you're a battery and you're going, from full to empty and you'll be depleted. If we're depleted, we're doing it wrong, right? That we're not taking time to let ourselves be fed or filled up by God. And also we should aim for mutuality in relationships so that we're not just martyrs who are running around trying to give ourselves away until there's nothing left, but that there should be, some reciprocity of that self-gift. And again, I think that's the vision of the Trinity, right? Augustine's definition of the Trinity is the lover, the beloved, and the love that bonds them together. Not two dudes and a bird, right? It's hard to see equality and mutuality when we think of the Trinity as two dudes and a bird, but if we think of it as love that is offered, received, and returned, and we take seriously that communion of love is in whose image and likeness we are made, then I think that's how we see that's how humans flourish, when we participate in those relationships where love can be offered, received, and returned. And that means having to pay attention to other people and getting out of this, Pope Francis called it, this soap bubble of vain self-concern, where everything is about me. And I get kind of like, if you can imagine a soap bubble, right, where you're just kind of off in your own little world and you're the center of the universe, then it's really easy to fall into what Pope Francis lamented as the globalization of indifference, where we just say, in the face of suffering or in the face of people who are on the receiving end of scorn, that's none of my business or it's not my problem.
So in all your travels, what has been your most memorable moment?
Oh, man. Rita, we're supposed to be wrapping up, not just getting started. Well, those of you who know me know that my life was changed in a garbage dump in the Dominican Republic. I was on a service trip in high school, and I was there with a group of boys from Marquette High, which I went to the all-boys Jesuit high school in Milwaukee. And we were there to build the only brick and mortar that this community in rural Dominican Republic, Comodoro Bajo, that was going to have. It was a village of people who didn't have running water or electricity. They lived in huts with dirt floors and thatch roofs and houses made of, twigs and twine. And I think there was a lot of white savior complex written into those group of 17-year-old boys. Here we are, to save the day. We're men for others. And looking down on these poor Dominicans who were going to be graced with our presence for the summer. And we were driving through town with Father Terry Brennan, who's a Jesuit priest, who is leading this program called Somos Amigos. And we were playing tourist, and we got to see churches and museums, and we went out to lunch, and we're just trying to learn a little bit about Dominican culture. And then we went to this lighthouse that was erected in 1992 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World, or whatever that means. And then right after that, we went to the city dump. And I remember we were in this van, and I was trying to figure out, why are we driving through a dump? And as I started to pay attention and look through the windows of this air-conditioned van, I noticed that there were people sorting through the garbage. And I asked Father Brennan what they were doing. And he said they're looking through the garbage for anything that they could eat, use, or sell. And it blew my mind as a 17-year-old that there were people who were sorting through other people's waste for a way to provide for themselves or their families. And then I noticed that there were people who were actually going into holes in the sides of these hills of garbage, and I asked Father Brennan what was going on, and he said some people had to live in the garbage dump because they used to live where the lighthouse now stood, and the Dominican government razed their homes and displaced them so they could build this tourist attraction. And because they were displaced, they didn't have anywhere else they could call home, so they had to make their home in this garbage dump. And I remember in this moment, thinking I've never been so physically close to other people, but felt so far away from them. Like, just how can we belong to the same human family when I have my very comfortable and bougie life in the suburbs of Milwaukee, where I really don't want for anything. And these are people that have to lay their head in other people's garbage to have any kind of shelter. And just as I'm about to get lost in, theologizing, you can see I'm a theologian in training at 17, but before I get lost in abstractions, Father Brennan stopped the van and told us to get out. And we open the van doors, and we get hit with this wave of heat and stench and smoke because the garbage dump was on fire to make room for more garbage. And we all doubled over and started to retch because it was just the most foul thing you could ever experience. There were all these flies everywhere. I mean, the dump is called Las Máscaras because of all the flies. And before we could, throw up and complain to Father Brennan and tell us to get out of here, these kids came out of nowhere, and they ran up to us, and they treated us like we were long-lost family members. They didn't ask us for money. They didn't call us weirdos. I mean, I don't think that they had ever seen Americans before. And I'm 6'5" now. I wasn't 6'5" then, but I was 2 or 3 times their height. I mean, we probably looked like giants to them. In fact, I remember some of the kids being like, "Hola, gigantes!" Their minds were blown at how tall we were. We did have at least a kid who was almost 7 feet. He was the number 1 volleyball recruit in the country and got a full ride to play volleyball at Stanford. So they did think he was a little bit of a spectacle. Anyway, so they made us human jungle gyms for the next 2 hours. We were taking kids by the wrist and swinging them around in circles. In Spanish, it's called a vuelta. We were throwing them up in the air and trying to catch them until I thought my arms were going to fall off. It was really moving to me that, here were these kids that I was feeling sorry for, that I would never want to trade places for in a million years, just looking at them from this position of moral superiority and just total pity, right? And they couldn't it. They couldn't see that their lives mattered less than anyone else's. And I always think of that line by Mother Teresa. She says, "If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other." And those kids saw that we belonged to each other, and I couldn't see it. And to be honest with you, I didn't really get it until a little while later. A man came up to Father Brennan and asked if Father Brennan would bless his home. So we went through the garbage, and we entered this cave. And this cave was just this dark, dank little hole in the side of garbage. And it was divided in half with a rope with some towels hung over it, so there would be some privacy. Because on the right, there was an old mattress and towels and clothes where he and his wife and their children slept. And on the left, there was nothing except for one table, one chair, and a framed picture of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And that's what hit me. It wasn't them. It wasn't being able to see the sacrament of these little kids or to see that they were equally precious and sacred in God's eyes. It was oh, they're Christians too. They're baptized like me. That's the same icon I pray to. And that's what hit me, and I'm kind of embarrassed of that if it hadn't been for that icon, I think I would have stayed looking down on them. But because I could see that we shared the same faith, then I saw, wow, we belong to each other as equal members of God's human family. And I've often thought about what it's like for Christ to look through that icon at the world and to see a world marked by so much unjust inequality, so much distrust and division, so much suffering and indifference to that suffering, and how that must just break God's heart. So that's the moment that really changed my life, and that's when I really decided, I want to do something so that we can create a world where we don't just have to resign ourselves to the fact that some people are going to have to live in a garbage dump.
This is a little different, but it's just been coming up in me, so I want to share it.
Sure.
So in the 70s, which wasn't too far after Vatican II and coming to liturgy here, one of my memories is of Leo Klein, a Jesuit, and he he was very into Vatican II and teaching about the meaning of the liturgy. And one of the images he used several that I remember. Images really are helpful. But he talked about at the end of the liturgy, the ite missa est, go, the mass is ended. And he highlighted the word go, like go. And that was coming up in me with a lot of the different quotes that were in here of we're sent. And that he used the image if there was a helicopter over the outside of the church. So when we go, think of all the different places everyone goes to. Like, you and I are not in any of the same places during the week. We're not. You can look around. We're all in different places. And so what this document, Gaudium et Spes, is talking about, we are sent out to all these different places to live the gospel, to live our care for one another, to live our care for our brothers and sisters. And then we come back to celebrate together how we have lived being a disciple all week long and knowing we are the living body of Christ. Christ died and rose, and we are the living body of Christ. We are doing what Christ did. We are doing that today. So I love that image of a helicopter over the outside of the chapel, seeing everybody going to all these different places, and then reassembling and bringing our experience, our faith, our God in our life together as we celebrate together. And that image just kept coming up to me as you were talking.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
I'm really thankful that we've had this series and have enjoyed these first two presentations, and particularly celebrating this 60th anniversary. But what also strikes me listening to this is just wondering where we are with implementing it. In some ways, it feels like there's at least a significant part that's pushing back and actually wanting to go back before it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, because this calls us to something so powerful and so important. It doesn't feel like
I
we've
think
done
that's a
much
fair
to
question. The theologian Orm Rush has spent a lot of time thinking about that question of reception. And if he were here, he would say we do have a lot more work to do to receive Vatican II and to really work to integrate it into the life stream of the church. So it's a fair question, and I think for an institution that's 2,000 years old, what's 60 years, right? Like this is still new, in the big picture. I don't know, Dr. Galler, as a historian, maybe you can say that more eloquently than I can, but I imagine it's going to take time for us to really to see the long view of how this is calling, not just to reform what the church was like in the mid 20th century, but to see how it's just the beginning of a new way of being church in the world. One of the things that I really love about Vatican II is that I think it's the moment where the church went from being a church centered in Rome to being more fully a global church, because you did have bishops like Câmara from Brazil coming and saying, this is what it's like for me in my context. And I don't think there should be a Vatican III. I think if we're going to double down on this being a global church, then the next, kind of council should be in like Nairobi or in Mexico City or in Manila, right? Like just to really put that emphasis on this being a global church and maybe even more explicitly going to the peripheries to say, okay, what is it like for you to be church? How can we learn from you about what it means to be church? And not just to do that as dyads or in a binary, but to do that. And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to do now with the Synod. So I see, the Synod on Synodality, which, we're continuing to participate in. When does it reconvene, Martin? 27 or 28? 28. So I think this process of trying to be a church that journeys together and to continue that process from, the closing document, the final document that was issued at the end of 2024, and then for the next 4 years. I think I see that through the lens of trying to continue to receive this vision of what it means to be church, and for people to figure out what does that look like in my neck of the woods. Ben.
So, Dr. Mescher, I think some of the beauty of your remarks tonight is that while Pope Francis was such a public figure and walked the walk a lot of this solidarity concept and his implementation of the Synod on Synodality and his encyclicals, this is a witness of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the church before Vatican II. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Jesus did not have ChatGPT or AI or those things. And we're in this world where, for the first time, our current Pope, Leo, is in a position where he is taking on the challenge of AI, that he's also called an opportunity that opens new horizons on many different levels. How do we approach solidarity and synodality in a world where we have this new avenue to distract ourselves from humanity? But at the same time, if we don't interact with it, there's not that Christian and witness to Jesus doesn't get to it.
Yeah, that's a good question, Ben. I think we're still in the typewriter phase of AI, right? These are just the early days, and I think most of what is happening right now is like Jurassic Park. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So I think we've got to be careful. Pope Francis released a really beautiful document in January of this year called Antiqua et Nova, talking about how wisdom is both ancient and new, and it's on AI. So if that's something you're interested in, Ben, you can Google Antiqua et Nova and find it. And in that document, Pope Francis makes a couple of claims. The first, as he says, is that AI is a creation of humanity, but it's not a creation of God. Right? So we should parse out the difference between human dignity, which is God-given, and the fact that this is a technology. And the Greek word technology, tech comes from techne, which means tool. So it's neutral as a tool. It depends on how we use it and for what end or telos, what goal. And so I think those are the kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves now. Are we just using it because it gives us shortcuts and saves time, or because it's entertaining to see AI create images and videos that are totally fake but would be hilarious? I have real concerns about the ecological, footprint of AI. Every time you ask ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot a question, we're using 16 ounces of water to cool the computers that are doing all of that, all those computations to come up with, those responses. So, for example, Elon Musk started an AI facility outside of Memphis, and Memphis has a huge water shortage because they're diverting all this water for these computers running AI, and then people don't have water. So there's a lot of ecological costs. I think there's going to be human costs, which is why, as a Catholic moral theologian, I think it's always helpful to keep our focus on the dignity of the human person and the common good, and to think about in what ways can AI be a tool to promote the dignity of the human person and to promote the global common good, and not just be a shortcut to entertainment or profit or whatever might be comfortable or convenient.
My question is kind of similar. When thinking about solidarity in today's world, I can't help but think of media and social media, and how we're able to, in one way, listen to so many new perspectives, have access to so many different things going on in the world, but at the same time, I think it can be a danger of fake or pseudo solidarity because we see all these things, but we're not doing anything about it. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I've written pretty long articles on that, so I have a lot that I could share. I think in the interest of time, I would say it's again, kind of like the question on AI. We should think about, what are we using social media for? For some people, it's an invaluable source of connection. If they feel cut off from their family or friends, or if they're alone in their geographic area, we know, for example, it's been a lifeline for LGBTQ youth who might be demonized in their local community, or for people who have handicaps or other disabilities who, because of their physical appearance, get reduced to people who see them in person. And online, you can be whoever you want to be. So I certainly think there are ways in which those digital tools and networks have been lifelines for people who've been pushed to the margins. But I think, by and large, it's been a tool for a lot of distraction and manipulation. The average American adult spends more time watching Netflix than talking with their kids. Most young people spend more time with the screen than they do sleeping. A lot of these products are free, and it's because we are the product. Our user data is what's driving the algorithms and keeping the platforms free. Psychologists are telling us it's digital heroin. There's a book that came out earlier this year by Chris Hayes called The Siren's Call, and it's all about how phones are basically like, they're like having Las Vegas in your pocket. Like if you think about sitting down at a slot machine, all the bright colors, the sounds, the chance of winning, right? Like that hit of adrenaline or dopamine or whatever's going on in your brain of like, oh my gosh, this could be so good, and I just keep pulling the wheel. Like for a lot of people, that's the scroll of their newsfeed where there's no end to it. We've spent literally millions of years of life on a screen, if you look at it in the aggregate. And I wonder how much of that is time that's wasted and missing out on the sacrament of our neighbor, kind of making us not really present to the people that we're close to. How much of it turns us into spectators, where we surrender some of our agency because we're just used to looking at our screen for what might be entertaining or interesting, or even if it's educational, right? Like I think it can, in some ways, reduce our agency rather than empower us. And we know, psychologists like Jean Twenge and Brene Brown and others, they've done studies that show that the more time you spend on social media, the higher the rates of anxiety, depression, and social isolation. So I think it is worth scrutinizing it a little bit more to think about. We call these tools for connection, but they're actually producing the exact opposite result. And so what is that about? And then, you could bring in all the manipulation, the fake news, all the ways that people are being deceived through, whether it's AI or people who are, bad actors and using their platforms to foment fear or to agitate or foster like this division of us versus them thinking. So I think, like I said with Ben, it's a tool. The question is how we use it and for what end. And I think we got to keep our eyes fixed on the dignity of the human person and the global common good.
Your last question.
All right, Marie, no pressure.
Well, we're on this gorgeous campus here at Xavier, and we're surrounded, all the neighborhoods surrounding us, Evanston and Avondale, are extremely poor. And through St. Vincent de Paul, we have the opportunity every week to visit our neighbors. They welcome us, their kids play with us, they pray with us. Every person we ever visit prays with us, and they're so full of faith and gratitude for that God woke them up this day. So I would like to invite everybody in this room to come on a Saturday morning and make a visit with us. We're there every Saturday in the parish center down the street from 9 in the morning till 12 or 12:30. Just come one time and go out with us and visit our neighbors. We go 2 by 2, and you'll experience encounter in a very beautiful way.
It's a great plug. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you. That's a wonderful last comment for... Thank you, Marie. Let me give Dr. Mescher a round of applause for his lecture.
Thanks.
And I don't want to forget, our next talk is on September 29th. It will be on Monday, not a Thursday, at 7 o'clock here. Bill Magis will be our presenter talking on Catholic-Jewish dialogue after 60 years. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
One, I just really enjoyed this very much.
Oh, thanks.
Are your remarks available? Because it's just some of the, like, I just love the one that you had about the food to the poor and they call me a saint.
Yeah, isn't it? It's a great line. Yeah.
Communist one.
I'll give you my card.
I've become a friend of Martin's.
Great.
Because that leads to the second one. I lived in Slovakia for 27 years. I just came back 2 years ago, so I'm really interested to hear about what your experience is like being in Warsaw. Because the church there, as Martin talks about, and as I've lived with, they didn't experience Vatican II. So it's a whole, there's a whole different issue. They know about charity, but they don't know about social justice.
They don't. That's why the U.S. Catholic Bishop is sending U.S. theologians to Warsaw and bringing this, to all of Eastern Europe because, as you said, it's all charity.
Oh yeah, and they didn't, especially